Stands the name of Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by his statement that the Household Labour Force Survey is, quote, the most rigorous form of measuring employment in the economy, end quote, and if so, what were the survey's results for unemployment for the last 4 quarters?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, the Household Labour Force Survey applies a very rigorous test for whether someone is unemployed. They are counted as unemployed if they are actively looking for as little as 1 hour's work a week. In the last quarter, for example, that included 33,000 students who were looking for a job, most probably for a part-time job alongside their study. To the second part of the member's question, over the last 4 quarters, the number of people unemployed has gone from 151,000 to 171,000, back to 156,000 and up to 170,000. So as you can see, the numbers bounce around quite a bit. Over the same period, the number of people receiving the unemployment benefit has actually dropped from 56,000 to 50,000.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Supplementary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he now concede that his government's economic policies have failed to lower unemployment in New Zealand?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, no, in the way that it's couched by the member. Obviously unemployment has risen, but that has to be seen in the context of the overall environment that we've been operating in. We can't wish away a global financial crisis, but I just say this. If we were theoretically to follow these policies, an emissions trading scheme that had a major impact on every New Zealand consumer and business, reversing the company tax cut that this government brought in, putting a levy on every single New Zealand consumer to pay for Christchurch, a capital gains tax on a quarter of the housing market but every single business in New Zealand, and we came up with that novel idea of following Zimbabwe and Argentina and printing money, then that would really add to unemployment. And by the way, they are the Green Party policies.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is unemployment growing at more than 1.5 times faster in New Zealand than across the average of the OECD over the last 4 years?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, at one level, unemployment's coming from a lower base in New Zealand than a lot of those countries. If you actually go and look at the OECD, most of those countries are above New Zealand in terms of an unemployment rate, and some of them, like Spain, are at very high levels, 25% of unemployment overall and 50% for young people. So that is one issue that's there. Countries have different ways of measuring things, but all I would say is if you go back to the unemployment benefit numbers and ask the obvious question, what were they in 1999 when the Household Labour Force Survey was 7.3% and what are they today? The answer is they were 150,000 back then, they're under 50,000 here, they dropped by about 400 last week, at which half was in Auckland. And I might also add, Mr. Speaker, if you were to go and look at the Jobs Online monthly report, you will notice that they increased by 5.6% alone in October.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Supplementary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the fact that unemployment in New Zealand has grown at 1.5 times the average in the OECD over the last 4 years, using the statistics in the Household Labour Force Survey, which the Prime Minister told us we should read? And isn't that a sign that his economic policies have failed?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
To the last part of the question, no.
The Honourable David Parker.
Is the Prime Minister insisting now on using benefit figures rather than the Household Labour Force Survey, which he previously described as the most rigorous form of measurement? Because just like Karl Rove on Fox News, he likes to misuse math to make himself feel better.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, for one thing, thank goodness David Parker's watching Fox News because he might learn something. As opposed to that lefty stuff he seems to be embroiled in normally. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, no, I'm simply pointing out that unemployment benefit is another way of looking at the economy, and I think that makes sense.
Dr. Russel Norman. Order. I've called Dr. Russell Norman.
Is the Prime Minister aware that according to the standardised statistics produced by the OECD, when he came to office, New Zealand had the 8th lowest unemployment in the OECD, and it now has the 15th lowest unemployment in the OECD, and that is a record of failure for his economic policies, even in comparison with all those other countries that he tells us are doing so badly?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's still in the bottom half of those, and I would point out that if one was to go and look at the issues that New Zealand faces vis-a-vis other OECD countries, I'd challenge the member to find other countries that really wanted to change their position, would not take New Zealand's position over theirs. If you look at our country, we have had a global financial crisis and the worst earthquake in a number of generations, and this government will be back in surplus within a few years' time. This is a well, I still think we're on track for 14-15 actually. So it's not changing my mind, David. You're changing your mind about whether you're challenging the leader or not, but I'm certainly not changing my mind. And don't worry, Grant Robinson's supporting you because he was in the paper yesterday saying he supports David.
Order. I think that's order. I'm on my feet. Order. Order. The Speaker's not involved in any of that, so we won't have any of that. Dr. Russell Norman, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the failure of the government's economic plan to lower unemployment, will he give renewed consideration to the green growth, green jobs proposals coming from the Pure Advantage Group, which includes successful New Zealand business people such as Sir Stephen Tindall, Joan Withers, Jeremy Moon and Justine Smythe?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, one thing I won't be doing, and that is ordering up a carbon-neutral printer like that member wants for his printing of money. No, Mr. Speaker, if you go and look at the policies that member is advocating, it is an ETS that goes on every single business. It is reversing the company tax rate.
Point of order, Dr. Russell Norman.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Members are entitled to raise a point of order, Dr. Russell Norman.
Mr. Speaker, the question was not about the policies of the Green Party, even if the Minister failed to actually put them across properly.
That's because of the time that's elapsed, I'll let the member repeat his question so members can hear it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Russell Norman.
In light of the failure of the government's economic plan to lower unemployment, will he give renewed consideration to the green growth, green jobs proposals from the Pure Advantage Group that includes successful New Zealand business people such as Sir Stephen Tindall, Joan Withers, Jeremy Moon and Justine Smythe?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of the first report, no, but I understand there's another report that's coming that might have some recommendations of interest and the government will look at those. But I go back to the first point. A failure of economic policy in this country would be to reverse the company tax cut that this government put in. It would be to ban mining and all the things that this government is doing to ensure that there are job creation. It would be to put a levy on every single consumer to pay for Christchurch. It would be a capital gains tax on every business in New Zealand. It would be an ETS. It would be an ETS that puts every consumer in worse situation, and it would be printing money so that every New Zealander.
Order. I think there's been sufficient of the answer there. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the government's failure to reduce unemployment, will he seriously consider the business case for New Zealand to embrace green growth and green jobs as advocated by the Pure Advantage Group that includes successful New Zealand business people such as Rob Fife, Philip Mills, Jeff Ross and Sir George Fistenich?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, the answer to the last question, there is a second report coming out, as I understand, from Pure Advantage, and there may be a number of aspects of that report that the government is interested in looking at. The member will also be aware that the government commissioned some work in this area, of which some of those recommendations we are following. And I simply go back and say that the member lives in a world where he's advocating policies which would be very negative for the economy, but comes into this House and pretends that have no impact at all. If that is the case, then he needs to go back and read his economic books.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has he seen statistics from the US Bureau of Labour which show the greener the industry, the higher the job growth over the last decade? And will he now reconsider his opposition to green growth strategies that are jobs rich and good for the environment?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, no one answered the first part of the questions. And in answer to the second part of the question, there's been quite a number of things that this government has done in relation to effectively green growth, and that would be including the very extensive insulation scheme that the government had. It's also got an ETS scheme which encourages people to plant trees. There's been a number of other things, Mr. Speaker, but not the ones that member is proposing.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't Pure Advantage Group correct when they argue that mining the environmentally valuable Denniston Plateau for coal, as proposed by Bathurst Resources, will have a detrimental effect on New Zealand's economically valuable green brand? And if so, why on earth is the Prime Minister championing a special cause, a special interest like Bathurst Resource?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, I don't think the member is right. And if I remember correctly, a few weeks ago, that member was on television telling New Zealanders that it was a shocking thing that those who worked at the solid energy mine on the west coast were losing their jobs at Spring Creek. And yet on the other side of the coin, he's now telling those very same miners that he doesn't want them to get a job down the road at Bathurst. Is he seriously saying because we have a small amount of mining activity relative to the size of New Zealand that somehow that undermines our whole overall proposition as a good country to do business, a good country to visit? I find that very hard to believe. And if you look at Australia, where the mining activity is very substantial, it doesn't stop them actually going out there and advertising extensively that Australia is both a good place to do business, a good place to live and a good place to holiday.
Question number 2, the Leader of the Opposition, David Shearer.